Ladies and gentlemen, Lee Bratcher discussing blockchain innovation with Senator Cory Gardner.
Senator, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Looking forward to this conversation. I think people have an expectation that we're going to come out the gate talking about FTX, but I actually have a different question to lead off for you.
You bet.
The next 2 years in DC, Congress is going to be really interesting. I think this election was surprising in how normally at this midterm you would expect the party out of the White House to do much better than they actually did. So we have a very sharply divided legislature, and probably more so than we expected. The House turns on just a couple seats, and obviously the Senate is even tighter. So what do you expect in the next 2 years?
I think all of the problems in Washington will probably be fixed by the time the session starts. So don't worry about that.
We can only hope.
I'm just kidding. So look, I think if you get into the nuts and bolts of sort of the history of midterms, everybody's seen that. You've all seen the political pundits on the news talk about this, that the average midterm loss for a party that shares the same party as the president, the majority party that shares the same party as the president, if that's the case, it's like almost 24 House members, 4 or 5 senators. In fact, I think the exact number is like 4.5 senators lose. And I'm like, well, who's the half senator that loses? So you end up seeing that. Now, we had a different outcome in a midterm election in 2018. We had where the Senate actually gained members of the Senate, sort of defying history for 60 or 70 years. And then in 2022, again, you see this sort of the Democrat majority in the House and the Senate defying history once again. So we've seen over the last couple of cycles where history hasn't exactly followed the same path. The numbers haven't followed history, I mean. And I think if you look at the 2022 election, I don't think enough attention has been sort of pointed to this continuation factor of the 2020 election. That you actually didn't have a separate and distinct 2022 election. You actually had a continuation of the 2020 election. So it was less of a midterm election, more of a presidential style election without the presidents on the ticket, but certainly hovering near the tickets. And by that, I mean, obviously the previous president, President Trump, and the current president, President Biden.
We could unpack that quite a bit.
There's a lot to talk about.
There's a lot to talk about. So as we think about specifically policy in this industry in DC, we've got a pretty tall hill to climb over the last couple of weeks. Where would you, and you do now currently work with CCI, the Crypto Council on Innovation, some of the gold standard organizations in this space are part of that. Where are you guys planning on starting?
Yeah, it's interesting. With the Council for Innovation, we were talking about some of the things that Congress, their behavior, what they think about, how they work. And there's 2 things that Congress hates. Congress hates success, and Congress hates failure. So somewhere on that spectrum, somebody's going to find themselves. And over the past couple of weeks, we've seen somebody who had the appearance of success and had the air of success, but gave dramatic failure. And so you've got the 2 things that Congress hates all balled up in one big bundle. And so they're going to then turn around over the lame duck session. They come back after the election. They're looking at a whole bunch of new members coming into the House and the Senate, regardless of Republican or Democrat side. There's a bunch of new members coming in January, all lined up to address what they hate, success and failure, and how that's going to look. And so I do think you had Ovik talked a little bit about the challenges that are facing industry now. Those are significant. Those are real. And my favorite saying in Washington is politics is the only place where sound travels faster than light. Think about the sound that you're hearing right now as a result of the last couple of weeks. And if that prevails, it's going to be a big challenge.
Absolutely. So do you think that these lame duck hearings that we will see over the next couple of weeks have any teeth? Or is it more signaling, we're going to do something about this, but we're just going to talk about doing something right now and then eventually?
They will sort of lay the foundation for what comes next. I think you will see what comes out of these, what's shaken out of these hearings, the information that's gathered and gleaned out of this. And that will go into additional legislation. I mean, obviously, the lame duck, a month or two ago, the lame duck session was supposed to be defined by legislation around DCCPA or something like that. You had the discussion earlier by the commissioner about the Gillibrand-Lummis legislation.
Right.
You had the Stabenow-Bozeman legislation. So there were conversations very much around those ideas.
Yeah.
FTX happens, and Congress is now looking at this going, they're the most cynical amongst members of Congress when it came to digital assets are looking at this and salivating. And I think that's the challenge. What Sam Bankman-Fried did, he was sort of the personification to Congress of the crypto bro. And now Congress has a crypto brat that they get to focus on. And that's the industry's challenge of coming together, building a coalition, building the grassroots advocacy, doing it from the outside in instead of the inside out, because traditionally the way Washington works is they build the coalition inside the Beltway. The lobbyists talk to the members, and it's a coalition of insiders. That's not going to work here to make sure that we thrive and allow innovation and opportunity to occur. What we have to do is figure out ways to build the coalition outside so that when those hearings come out, when all of the criminal behavior comes out, that they don't try to destroy, but they try to protect, create stability, and create the soundness that we are looking for.
Now, the House has some strong leaders in this space. You've got Davidson, Emmer, Soto, Patrick McHenry, who I believe is now going to be the chair of Financial Services. On the Senate side, in the upper chamber, who do you think is going to be carrying the mail? I think one of them's probably coming up behind us, but there's got to be people on both sides of the aisle too.
Yeah, no doubt. If you look at the Council for Innovation, we identified about 29 digital future champions. These are the people who have been through thick and thin, who have been on this from day one. And certainly Senator Cruz is one of them, who's been a passionate advocate and somebody who understands and well-educated on issues and how this works. And so I think you've got people like Ted Cruz, who will continue to be a leader. You've got people like John Bozeman, who will continue to be a leader on the Ag Committee. The Ag Committee, don't forget that the Ag Committee has an incredibly important role. The commissioner talked about how the CFTC, the oversight committee for the CFTC, is the United States Senate Agriculture Committee, the U.S. House of Representatives Agriculture Committee. And they have one very important bill coming up. Every 5 or 6 years, they have a farm bill come up. And as we look at policy, that farm bill, G.T. Thompson, a chairman of the House Ag Committee, John Bozeman, a ranking member, Debbie Stabenow, chairwoman of the Ag Committee in the Senate. That legislation, the Farm Bill, could take on a whole new meaning far beyond some of the traditional topics it's covered, because it's a must-pass piece of legislation in a committee that has jurisdiction over a very important part of this ecosystem.
And that's key. The must-pass legislation, that seems like the only things that actually do pass.
Well, and must-pass legislation can be narrowed down to basically 2 or 3 things in Congress. You obviously have the funding of the government, but that gets bogged down into continuing resolutions and omnibus appropriations bills. And so that's not even something that they're able to process anymore as a one-off. Then you have the National Defense Authorization Act, which funds our Department of Defense. That's passed 61 years in a row, I think, every year for 61 years in a row. And then you have the Farm Bill. Every 5, 6 years, like I said, that must pass, because the biggest part of spending in the Farm Bill is food assistance programs, food stamps, those kinds of things, food nutrition programs. But that's what you can narrow it down to, that handful of things. And so as a lawmaker looks for a place to put an amendment in, or put legislation in, or put an entire bill into, it gets narrow pretty quick. If they can't get a standalone vote, which is very tough in the Senate. I mean, Senator McConnell used to say that legislative time is the coin of the realm. And if Chuck Schumer can't find the time to put something on the floor, it goes right into one of these other must-pass bills.
So when people ask me what at the federal level are the 2 most important pieces of legislation or policy concepts that we have to work on, before a couple of weeks ago, I always said stablecoin legislation and de minimis exemptions, so that this technology can be used for point of sale more easily, right?
Yeah.
De minimis being that you don't have a tax capital gains implication when you're spending to get your coffee or your whatever your point of sale item is there any chance of that now? Are we, is that back burner?
So I think the focus needs to be on a couple of things. Number one, we have a broader education focus that we have to get to. Broader education focus with members of Congress. People like Ted Cruz obviously have been, like I said, at the forefront of this. They understand it, but there are new members of Congress who don't have that level of understanding yet. And we need to make sure that we're providing those opportunities. And what I hope that everybody here tries to be is, I like to refer to it as a first call opportunity. The first call. If somebody has a question about stablecoin, if somebody has a question about de minimis, if somebody has a question about legislation by Senator Gillibrand or Senator Lummis, the RFIA, I think you were talking about, RFIA you were talking about earlier, the first call that they make, who's it going to be to? Is it going to be to somebody who opposes the work that we're doing, the innovations that are occurring? Or is it going to be somebody who can try to explain how this is a huge opportunity, not just for the US, but people around the globe who've never had opportunity before? And so I would encourage everybody here to build relationships with their member of Congress, their House member, their Senate member, so that when that challenge, their staffers, their district offices, their state offices, so that when that question comes, when that memo is going to be written to that member of Congress, they call you and say, hey, how do I explain this in terms people can understand? What's the public policy implication of this? And so I think that education component has to be part of this first, before any legislative effort. It has to be continuing alongside the legislative efforts as we go. I do think the legislative efforts are going to change. I think the hope for something in lame duck obviously is going to be even more of a challenge. I think next year what we have to do is make sure that that the two identified areas of hate, of success and failure, don't result in a bill that blocks the opportunity America has in innovation and growth in digital assets, that we come up with legislation that promotes our leadership, that preserves that role, that protects consumers, that creates soundness and safety for consumers. Those are the things that we have to look at. Do I think something is going to pass? I think there's a good probability it will in the next 2 years. Whether it's in one of those 2 or 3 bills I talked about, What is that going to be? A lot of what that is going to be depends on who that first call is made to. Is it made to somebody who wants to see us go away? Or is it made to somebody who wants to see innovation and U.S. leadership flourish?
So we've all heard that staffers run D.C., and here in Austin, similar.
I was told by Ted Cruz that Texas runs D.C. I don't know if that's, I don't know.
We'd like to think so. And maybe sometimes we do. But the challenge is, if you spend all your time educating staffers, then you really put the onus on them to convince their boss. So where do you prioritize educational efforts between the staffer and the member?
Look, you can't just have education focused at the staffer, right? It's great for the staffer. As a staffer, boy, that makes you a pretty good point person, but you need to make sure that it's directed at the member themselves as well. Taking the time to build relationships with them, taking the time so that that first call isn't just to their staffer for the member of Congress, but she'll pick up the phone and call you and ask the questions, or maybe be the member in the committee hearing who can correct the record and say, that's not actually how this works.
That's key.
And so it does have to be directed to the member. And that goes back to this sort of idea of building the grassroots coalition, building from the outside in, because the more support we have at home, at the town hall when that member stands up, the better off it's going to prevail in common sense, and good policy will prevail in the halls of Congress. I mean, look, if you're a member of Congress and you have 300, 400 people show up at a town hall meeting, and somebody stands up and says, you know what the last 2 weeks did to me? I put all my money into this and it's gone. What is that member of Congress going to do? Member of Congress isn't going to say, well, gee, thanks for coming.
That's the price of innovation.
That's right. That's not what you're going to hear. You're going, and the answer isn't going to be just to pat them on the back or pat them on the head and say, well, come back next time and tell me if it's better. No, they're going to take that. They're going to go back to their staff and they're going to say, hey, this is what I heard. This is what we have to do. And that idea that starts at that town hall, then turns into a memo from a staffer or from the senator to the staffer, and then it turns into legislation, and then it turns into a coalition they try to build within Congress. That's what we're dealing with. And so that's why it's so important that we take the time, whether it's the Texas Blockchain Summit right here in 2022, to build that coalition, but then to continue to reach out, sticking with the champions that we know are there,
Right.
making sure they have the support you need, that you've got their back, but also building new ones along the way.
And I'm hoping you can educate us, provide us some insights from your perspective as we go in to have those conversations. It's not like passing them in the halls. We can do this. It's going to have to be a substantial amount of time, and that is hard to come by for members. Yeah. So what is your advice and guidance as we, how do we not step on the landmines, but actually get that extended amount of time for those conversations?
Yeah. Look, I mean, time is such a precious resource because the demands are incredible. But you can invite them to your business. You can invite them to speak to your colleagues. You can invite them to speak at organizations like the Texas Blockchain Council, like you have this week. You can go to Washington. You can take the time to be there. You can present opportunities for education. You can present opportunities for forums and online chats and teletown halls that will build to this level of education, to reach out, to have that established connection. It's a matter of finding the time and being a value to them. And presenting something that they need, and that is, the power of information and knowledge in an industry that a lot of people simply don't understand yet, and especially with 10 or 15% of Congress being new, never served, they're going to be looking, they're going to be hungry for the kind of leadership and information that you can provide.
So, in your advocacy efforts, what are your focuses in the next couple of months?
Yeah, look, the focus in the next couple of months, obviously we spent a lot of time on the election. The Digital Future Award represented, I think, an opportunity for us to recognize those champions in Congress who have introduced legislation, who've written letters to the various regulatory agencies, who've weighed in on important matters, and who've shown to their constituents the opportunity to lead. We did a poll, the Council for Innovation did a poll, and we're actually doing a poll every quarter now to track consumer thoughts, sentiment, and voter attitudes as it relates to blockchain, digital assets, and what it means. And so what we know is this, that the American people believe this is part of our economy and it's here to stay. That the American people are going to take into account when they vote the viewpoint of a candidate who's running for office when it comes to digital assets. But the American people are also very afraid that they could lose out if we don't have the right structure in place. And I think that's what this last couple of weeks have given us, to make sure that Congress doesn't go to the extreme of hurting industry, hurting innovation, but also knowing that we can do what's right when it comes to safety and soundness for consumers. So that's my focus, is working with the Council for Innovation to make sure that we're getting all of those things right.
And you mentioned the poll there. I think polling is really important, because that's sort of a sounding board for elected officials to see the pulse of the nation. Yeah. We conducted a poll a couple months ago, and some of the audience may have heard me talk about this briefly yesterday. In Texas, 29% of Texans own Bitcoin or other digital assets, and much higher than
I thought you were going to say 29% of Texans own a home in Colorado. I thought that's what you were going to say.
That's probably like 50%.
But I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Yeah.
And I do want to ask you about Colorado versus DC and where you're spending most of your time. Hopefully Colorado, it's beautiful.
Absolutely,
there. Okay, good. So the polling, and these polls are expensive.
Yeah, they are.
Very expensive. Not every state has the resources to poll their the people or likely voters of that state to do that. Are you aware of some grassroots ways to do that a little bit more effectively, or how do we get the pulse of the nation without spending millions of dollars?
Yeah, well, I think the election this past couple weeks shows that even if you get a way to do that, the polling may not always show you what's going to happen or not. But I think for instance, the work that we're doing, Crypto Council for Innovation, the polling that we put out there is going to be public. It's published every 3 months or so, every quarter that we do it. And it does provide a good glimpse. And there's others that have done it. I mean, Paradigm has done it. I think Grayscale just came out with something as well, and some others that have put forward a lot of good numbers and good information. And if you follow political polling, if you follow individual races, you probably look at things like the 538 political average or the Real Clear Politics political average, so that you're not just reliant on one pollster, but you're looking at them all together, and you get a better idea of what it's going to look like. And I think that's what we ought to do with the world that we're in blockchain, and this, trying to figure out, all right, from this group, what do people think about digital assets? What does it mean to the Council for Innovation? Those are the kinds of things that we can be focusing on. It's expensive. But it's important to understand that for a policymaker to know that their voters know this is a part of the economy that's not going away, for policymakers to know that, anywhere from 13 to 18, 19% of the American people hold a digital asset. That's important for them to know, to see what damage is done to their support if they go against them is important to know. And when it comes to elections in 2 years, this is going to be even more important to them. And that's why we have to keep tabs on this.
A lot of these elections are decided by 1 or 2 percentage points. So,
well, in Colorado, we got a race that I think will be decided by 400 or 500 votes.
Wow.
Which is a 0.4 or so percent race. So wow. People in this room had enough power to sway an entire election in Colorado in the 3rd congressional district.
It's amazing. You're so good at thinking on your feet. I'm going to actually take some time to let the audience ask a question or two. I've been asking too many questions and hogging the mic. So we do have time for 1 or 2 questions from the audience. And I'm just going to have you shout it out because I don't want to take time to walk a mic to you.
I do. I do. Bitcoin. So, but we, the opportunity we just had the great speech talking about how Bitcoin's not crypto, I think is what the conversation was earlier. But look, we had a great discussion when we were doing the poll about how we could identify who owns what and how to get those assets known to policymakers. It's an important question to ask and that we keep reminding elected officials about. Yeah.
The phraseology that I always use is Bitcoin, blockchain, digital assets, so that we have, because everybody in the mainstream or maybe on Capitol Hill thinks about it as one entity. And not that we're ranking things or anything like that, but we need to have them separate that out and say, okay, Bitcoin is, if they just think like digital gold, okay, good, we've got that. If digital assets, maybe it's a tokenized security like real estate or something like that's allowing real estate to trade on a more liquid basis. That way they have a more nuanced understanding. That takes time.
And if you want to see some of the challenges Congress faces in getting their hands around technical issues, technology, and new things that are happening in our economy, one of them was there was a hearing in front of the United States Senate Commerce Committee, and I want to say it was around 2017, maybe it was 2018, but it was a Facebook hearing, and it was with Mark Zuckerberg. And you can look at those questions that were asked by members of Congress. I encourage you to watch this hearing and determine for yourselves whether they fully understood what was going on. And so when it comes to the challenge of making sure people understand the differences, NFT, when it comes to understand the difference between one technology versus another, versus centralized apps versus decentralized Bitcoin, it's important that they have the education that we talked about.
Exactly. All right, we have time for one more question. Yes, sir.
Do you have any advice for us as miners to help bridge the gap with Congress, people in the House that struggle with comprehending technology, specific to us going through SEC filing processes and getting repeated questions over and over after giving an answer that they just don't comprehend?
Well, sometimes it's not a lack of comprehension, it's a lack of agreeing with their answer. You know what I mean? So a member of Congress may know fully well what the answer they're getting. They may understand exactly the point, but it may not be the answer they want. So they're going to keep repeating the question, thinking maybe if you hit it enough times, somebody's going to give, or that yes becomes a no, or the no becomes a yes, or something like that. So I think my advice to you is to continue. The relationships you build are incredibly important, but also the coalition of people that we can build who know that if something adversely affects miners, that it adversely affects their holding. And so I think that's the challenge, that the bridge that we need to link, so that when that policy goes through or that position gets taken, that it's not just the miners that come to them and say, hey, this is a problem. It's the entire ecosystem that says, hey, this is a real problem for all of us. And that's where I think we can build and do a better job of building the advocacy, the grassroots, to influence and to make a difference when it comes to public policy.
Ladies and gentlemen, join me in thanking Senator Gardner for being here today.
Thanks for having me. Enjoy it. Thanks, Lee.
I'm Lee Bratcher, the president of the Texas Blockchain Council. Thank you to everyone who came out to this year's summit, helping us make it the best one yet. Now more than ever, we need professional industry associations like the TBC to help craft effective policy instead of the CEOs of centralized exchanges roaming the halls of various state capitals or in DC. Texas is quickly becoming the center of the universe for Bitcoin, blockchain, and digital assets. If you want to be part of the future that we are crafting here in Texas, join the TBC today.